September 1st, 1943. Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. The air inside the operations tent was heavy, sticky with the tropical humidity that clung to every piece of paper and every uniform. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous surviving ace, leaned over the intelligence report spread across the wooden table. His right eye scanned the words carefully. His left eye had been blinded a year earlier by American gunners over Guadalcanal. Then he chuckled, and within seconds he laughed out loud. "The Americans have built a new fighter," he read to the room. "Heavy as a bomber, wide as a transport. They call it the Hellcat." Around him, junior pilots glanced at each other and smiled. Outside the tent, lined up in perfect order on the pierced steel planking, sat the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Mitsubishi A6M-0, sleek, nimble, and deadly. For nearly 2 years, the Zero had ruled the skies of the Pacific. British Hurricanes, American P-40 Warhawks, even the Dutch Brewster Buffalo, all had been chewed apart by its machine guns. And now the enemy wanted to challenge the Zero with this, a bloated, oversized beast that weighed twice as much. To Sakai and his men, it was proof, once again, of what they already believed. America could build machines, but not fighters. One pilot whispered, "Another flying cow. We will cut them from the sky like we always do." Laughter filled the humid tent. What none of those men could have known, what even Sakai himself could not imagine, was that within 30 days, this so-called flying cow would begin rewriting the mathematics of aerial combat. The F6F Hellcat would go on to destroy 5,223 enemy aircraft while losing only 270 in air-to-air combat, a kill ratio of 19-1. It would not just match the Zero, it would bury it. And the irony, the very men laughing that morning in Rabaul would, within months, be writing final letters to their families, knowing that meeting a Hellcat in the sky meant almost certain death. The laughter of September 1943 was not arrogance. It was confidence built on 2 years of easy victories. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, from Darwin to the Dutch East Indies, the Zero had been untouchable. But every empire, every weapon, and every warrior eventually meets something that changes the game forever. The Hellcat was about to be that something. For the Japanese pilots in 1943, their confidence wasn't blind arrogance. It was built on a machine that had seemed almost supernatural when it first appeared in the skies. The Mitsubishi A6M-0. One of Japan's top aces, Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, once described it in his diary with words that still sound almost poetic. "Flying the Zero is like wearing wings. The aircraft responds to thought, not just to control." That was no exaggeration. The Zero had range like a bomber, agility like a biplane, and the firepower to shred anything it caught. When American engineers first got their hands on a captured Zero in 1942, they simply didn't believe the test results. How could one fighter do all of that? It seemed to defy physics. But the secret was no magic trick, it was sacrifice. To make the Zero light and agile, Japanese designers stripped away everything unnecessary. No armor plate around the cockpit, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Radios often removed. Every single pound was shaved off. The result was a fighter 30% lighter than American planes of the same class, and it showed in combat. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese losses were only 29 planes, while the Americans lost 347. In the Philippines, 7 Japanese aircraft downed compared to 103 American planes destroyed. Over Darwin, Australia, 2 Japanese planes lost, 30 Allied aircraft gone. Numbers like that weren't just victories, they were annihilations. Imagine being a young Japanese pilot in 1942. You strap into a machine that dances in the air, turns tighter than anything else, and seems almost alive under your hands. You look across the Pacific and see enemies struggling to keep up in clumsy, overweight aircraft. For 2 years, every fight ends the same way. You on top, them falling in flames. It was intoxicating. The Zero wasn't just a fighter. It was a symbol of Japanese mastery, proof that their empire could outdesign and outfight the so-called industrial giants. So when news came of the Hellcat, and pilots laughed at its weight, its bulk, its apparent sluggishness, can you blame them? To their eyes, America was making the same mistake it had always made, building heavy machines that couldn't possibly match the purity of the Zero's design. The laughter in Rabaul that September wasn't foolishness. It was the confidence of warriors who believed they had already seen everything America could throw at them, but history was about to prove them wrong. The Zero's reign of terror had been built on fragile foundations. Foundations the Hellcat was designed, piece by piece, to shatter. While Japanese pilots were laughing in Rabaul, halfway across the world in Bethpage, New York, the scene was very different. The men and women of the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation weren't laughing. They were sweating, hammering, and welding inside crowded factory halls, racing against time. America had already learned bitter lessons in the first 2 years of the war. The Wildcat, Grumman's earlier fighter, had fought bravely but was clearly outclassed by the Zero. U.S. Navy pilots survived only by inventing desperate tactics like the thack weave, just to stay alive. The Navy needed something new, something that could not only fight the Zero, but crush it. That responsibility fell on Leroy Grumman, a tough, plain-spoken engineer who had built his company on designing rugged planes for the Navy. When asked what the new fighter should be, his answer was simple: it has to bring our boys home. The design that emerged in 1942 was not elegant. In fact, many test pilots thought it looked downright clumsy. A barrel-shaped fuselage, oversized wings, heavy landing gear. To some, it looked more like a flying truck than a fighter plane. But beauty wasn't the goal. Survival was. The engineers gave the Hellcat something the Zero had deliberately thrown away: protection, armor plates around the cockpit, bulletproof glass in front of the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks that wouldn't turn a single bullet hit into a fireball. And under the cowling, they placed the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine that produced more than 2,000 horsepower, nearly double what the Zero could deliver. A Navy test pilot remembered his first flight. It felt heavy on the stick, like you were hauling a load of bricks, but when you shoved the throttle forward, Lord, it just kept climbing. On the factory floor, workers, many of them women who had never built an airplane before the war, worked 3 shifts around the clock. They tightened bolts, laid rivets, wired radios, and tested engines. One young woman remembered in an interview years later, "We knew we weren't just building planes. We were building the wings that our brothers and husbands would come home on." To the Japanese, the Hellcat looked like a design failure. To American engineers and workers, it was a shield and a hammer rolled into one. A plane that could take punishment, strike hard, and give a young Navy pilot a fighting chance against the aces of Japan. The irony was sharp. What looked like a clumsy mistake from afar was, in fact, the exact answer to the Zero's brilliance. The Hellcat wasn't designed to outdance the Zero. It was designed to survive its attacks, climb above it, and hit back with 650 caliber machine guns spitting out more lead than any Japanese fighter could endure. Ugly, maybe. Heavy, certainly. But in war, survival beats beauty every time. By late summer 1943, the first squadrons of Hellcats were rolling off American carriers, their dark blue paint gleaming under the Pacific sun. To the pilots climbing into them, these weren't flying cows. They were deliverance. The stage was set. The laughter in Rabaul was about to meet the roar of American industry at full throttle. September 30th, 1943. Marcus Island, Northwest Pacific. Petty officer, First Class Yoshio Fukui, had flown dozens of missions in his Mitsubishi Zero. By now, he knew the silhouette of every Allied aircraft, P-40s, P-39s, even the squat B-25 bombers. But on this day, Escorting a reconnaissance plane, he saw something that didn't fit. 6 dark blue shapes climbing out of the southeast sky. At first, he thought they were bombers. Their fuselages looked too fat, their wings too short. But as the sunlight caught them, he saw the truth. Not bombers, fighters. His after-action report would later record his first impression. The Americans have mounted fighter guns on a torpedo bomber. Instinct took over. Fukui rolled into a tight diving turn, the bread-and-butter move of every Zero pilot. He expected the heavy American fighter to keep plowing straight ahead, sluggish and slow. The Zero, lighter and more nimble, would curve neatly onto its tail. It was a tactic that had worked for 2 years. But something astonishing happened. The American plane didn't try to turn. It went straight up. The Pratt Whitney double Wasp engine roared, hauling the Hellcat skyward at a climb rate the Zero couldn't dream of. Fukui yanked back on his stick, trying to follow, but he felt his airspeed bleeding away. His Zero clawed for altitude, but it was like chasing a hawk with a sparrow's wings. At 15,000 feet, the impossible unfolded. The Hellcat performed a hammerhead turn, a brutal vertical maneuver that should have been impossible for such a heavy aircraft. It stalled at the top, whipped around, and came down nose first, straight onto Fukui's tail. Tracer fire streaked past his canopy. 650 caliber machine guns opened up, hurling a storm of lead unlike anything he had ever faced. In 3 seconds, his Zero took 17 hits. Holes ripped across the wings, smoke poured from the fuselage, and the controls shuddered in his hands. Fukui barely escaped by kicking his aircraft into a desperate spin, tumbling earthward, half out of control. Somehow, he coaxed the crippled Zero back to Marcus Island. His wingman never returned. Neither did the reconnaissance plane they had been protecting. For the first time, Japanese pilots realized something terrifying. The new American fighter did not play by the old rules. It didn't need to turn tighter. It didn't need to dance gracefully. It fought in a new dimension, straight up and straight down, using raw power instead of acrobatics. That day, the Hellcat scored its first confirmed victories. First blood, as the Americans would call it. Back at Rabaul, reports filtered in. Pilots who had laughed at the Hellcat's bulk now read Fukui's account in silence. He described the firepower as overwhelming, the armor as impenetrable, the climbing ability as something that should not be possible. The laughter had stopped, but this was only the beginning. Marcus Island was a skirmish, a small taste of what was coming. In just 5 days, the Hellcat would face its first true test at Wake Island, where numbers, tactics, and pride would collide, and the results would shake the Japanese air arm to its core. October 5th, 1943. Wake Island, Central Pacific. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, a veteran of countless dogfights, adjusted his goggles as his formation of 12 Zeros climbed to 20,000 feet. Below them, the sea shimmered, broken only by the distant shapes of American carriers. This was familiar ground. For months, American raids on Japanese positions had been little more than harassment. A few bomb runs, some strafing passes, then the carriers would turn and run before Japan's fighters could fully engage. Today, Shiga believed, would be no different. But as his Zeros leveled off above the clouds, he spotted something strange below. 12 American fighters, flying in 3 tight divisions. Shiga's diary later recalled the moment. We had every advantage. Altitude, position, surprise. Victory was certain. The order came. The Zeros rolled over and dove, sun at their backs, tracers spitting from their 20mm cannons. Japanese doctrine had always been clear. Hit hard from above, then use the Zero's unmatched agility to finish the kill in tight turns. But what happened next shattered that doctrine forever. The Hellcats did not scatter. They did not break into desperate turns. They held formation, steady, disciplined, almost unnervingly calm. Rounds ripped through the air, some striking their wings and fuselages. But instead of bursting into flames as Zeros often did, the Hellcats absorbed the punishment. Their armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks held. What should have been lethal hits became nothing more than scratches. The Japanese pilots emptied their magazines in diving passes, confident the Americans would crumble. Instead, when their ammunition was gone, the real fight began. The Hellcats climbed, full throttle, engines howling. They surged upward into thinner air, where the Zero's engine began to gasp for oxygen. At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat still produced over 1,600 horsepower. And the Zero, by contrast, was choking down to barely 900. Then the Hellcats came down, like hawks swooping on sparrows. 650 caliber machine guns per aircraft unleashed a storm of fire. Japanese pilots who had expected graceful turning duels instead found themselves torn apart in slashing dives. In less than 10 minutes, 8 Zeros fell blazing into the sea. Not a single Hellcat was lost. Lieutenant Shiga survived, but his words were grim. Their weight gave them speed we could not match. They climbed higher, dove faster, and their guns were merciless. We could not fight them. Back on Wake Island, the surviving Japanese pilots gathered in stunned silence. For 2 years, their tactics had been gospel: outturn the enemy, bleed them dry in the dance of angles. But now, the Americans refused to dance. They had rewritten the rules. To the Japanese, this was more than defeat. It was confusion, even disbelief. How could an aircraft so heavy, so ungainly, not only survive but dominate? For the Americans, it was vindication. The ugly airplane from Grumman had proven its worth. It didn't need elegance. It had power, armor, and teamwork. It was built to fight a different kind of war. The Zero had met its match, and for the first time, Japanese naval aviators began to sense it. But the worst was still to come. Wake Island was only the prelude. Ahead lay battles where hundreds of planes would clash, and the Hellcat would turn from promising newcomer into executioner. While Japanese pilots at Wake Island were stunned into silence, thousands of miles away aboard American carriers, the atmosphere felt almost casual. To the men of the U.S. Navy, war was serious. But life at sea also carried its own rhythm, filled with small comforts that reminded them what they were fighting for. The mess deck smelled of fresh coffee. Sailors lined up with metal trays, some piling on powdered eggs, others scooping oatmeal, bacon, or canned fruit. On hot Pacific days, ice cream appeared, sometimes vanilla, sometimes chocolate, always welcome. Coca-Cola bottles clinked in the hands of young men barely out of high school, bought for 5 cents at the ship's canteen. One sailor later recalled, "We'd eat, drink our Coke, and joke with each other. And then, maybe an hour later, we'd be climbing into those planes, heading out to fight for our lives." It was strange. The normal mixed right in with the deadly. In the ready rooms, pilots lounged in khaki flight suits, listening to swing music crackle from portable radios. Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, the voices of home carried across thousands of miles of ocean. Some pilots wrote quick letters, never knowing if they'd live to mail them. Others flipped through worn photographs of wives, girlfriends, and children. And then came the call. "Pilots, man your planes." The carrier's deck erupted into motion. Sailors in color-coded shirts directed traffic with hand signals. Engines coughed, sputtered, and roared to life. Propellers blurred into spinning discs, the smell of high-octane fuel mixed with the salt air. One by one, the Hellcats rolled forward, hooked to the catapults, or racing down the long wooden deck. Their dark blue wings gleamed in the tropical sun as they clawed into the sky. For the Japanese, each aircraft lost was nearly irreplaceable. For the Americans, each launch was proof of industrial strength. Factories back home were producing Hellcats by the thousands, rolling off assembly lines faster than the Navy could deploy them. A pilot once said, as he strapped in, "The Zeros may have elegance, but we've got numbers, we've got armor, and we've got the folks back home building us more planes than the enemy can shoot down." As the formation disappeared into the blue horizon, the men left behind on deck watched quietly. Some prayed, others lit cigarettes, leaning against the rail. For them, this was the new normal. War fought from floating airfields, powered not just by courage, but by Coca-Cola, swing music, and the endless hum of American industry. Every Hellcat that lifted off was more than a machine. It was the weight of a nation, carried on wings of steel. By the spring of 1944, the laughter of Japanese pilots had long vanished. In its place was something new, fear of the numbers, because numbers don't lie, and the Hellcat's numbers were brutal. In less than 2 years of combat, the F6F Hellcat destroyed 5,223 enemy aircraft in the Pacific Theater. It lost only 270 in air-to-air combat. That meant every time a Hellcat went down, 19 Japanese aircraft had been burned from the sky, a kill ratio of 19-1. To put that in perspective, if 12 Hellcats launched from a carrier deck, statistically, they could expect to return having destroyed more than 200 enemy planes before losing a single one of their own. The Japanese couldn't comprehend it. Their Zeros had once cut through Allied squadrons with ease. But now, the numbers were reversed. Every engagement bled their ranks dry. Aces replaced by rookies. Rookies sent into battles they had no chance of surviving. The numbers weren't just about kills in the air. They told the story of industry, of training, of logistics. In 1943, American factories were producing more Hellcats in a single month than Japan could replace in half a year. The average American pilot arrived in the Pacific with 350 hours of training behind him. A Japanese pilot in 1944, sometimes less than 100. And while Japan's oil reserves were collapsing, American carriers sailed with floating fuel depots, keeping Hellcats in the air day after day. One Japanese officer, captured after the war, summed it up bitterly. "We fought the Hellcat, but in truth, we fought America itself. We fought your factories, your oil, your women on the assembly lines, your farmers who fed the world. The Hellcat was only the tip of the spear." For American sailors and pilots, these numbers weren't just cold statistics. They meant life. Each ratio meant one more son, one more husband, one more brother who came home alive instead of vanishing into the sea. But for the Japanese, the same numbers spelled doom. Every mission meant fewer veterans, fewer aircraft, fewer chances of survival. The war in the air was no longer a duel of pilots. It was a math problem, and the solution was already written. The Zero had ruled the skies through agility and daring. The Hellcat ruled them with armor, firepower, and overwhelming numbers. And soon, in the greatest carrier battle of the war, those numbers would explode into history in a single day of slaughter the Americans would never forget, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. By late 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy's fighter force was a shadow of what it had been at Pearl Harbor. The proud aces who once laughed at American machines were gone, shot down, burned alive, or lost forever in the Pacific. In their place came boys, barely trained, sent into cockpits with just a handful of flight hours. For these young men, the Hellcat wasn't just another enemy fighter. It was a death sentence waiting in the sky. One Japanese pilot, Ensign Masao Ito, wrote a final letter to his wife before flying his last mission in October 1944. "If I do not return, please know it is because I faced the blue American fighter. They say it is impossible to defeat. When we meet them, we die. But I will try. Forgive me for leaving you." This was the reality. Hellcats didn't have to fight fair. They climbed higher, dove faster, and absorbed punishment that would have turned a Zero into a fireball. Japanese pilots quickly learned the awful truth. Once a Hellcat had you in its sights, there was almost no escape. Veteran survivors recalled the hopelessness. One described looking over his shoulder during a dogfight and seeing 3 Hellcats closing in. "They came from above and below, and I knew I was already dead. The sky belonged to them. We flew only because our commanders told us to. Inside, we understood it was useless. This despair soon transformed into something darker, the birth of the kamikaze. By late 1944, the Japanese High Command faced the truth they had tried to deny. Traditional air combat was finished. The Hellcat had destroyed the Zero's reign, and Japan could no longer replace its losses. Out of desperation, young pilots were told to turn their planes themselves into weapons. If they could not win in combat, they would win by dying. It was a tragic shift, born directly out of the hopelessness Hellcats created. American pilots who faced kamikazes understood the desperation. One Hellcat pilot later said, "We weren't fighting warriors anymore. We were fighting boys ordered to die." The Hellcat didn't just break their planes, it broke their spirit. For Japanese pilots, the laughter of 1943 had turned into final farewells, written on scraps of paper, folded into flight jackets, never to be read until after the war. For Americans, it was proof of what overwhelming power could do, not just to machines, but to the human heart of an enemy. But the true, unforgettable demonstration of that power was still ahead. The day the Pacific skies turned into a shooting gallery, and the Hellcat earned its most infamous victory in history. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. While Japanese pilots wrote farewell letters and climbed into cockpits with no hope of return, half a world away, another kind of army was fighting the war, without rifles, without uniforms, and without medals. In the sprawling Grumman plant at Bethpage, Long Island, the roar of riveting guns never stopped. Day and night, 3 shifts of workers turned out Hellcats like clockwork, men too old for combat, teenagers fresh out of school, and women, thousands of women, who had never seen an airplane before the war, but now built them with steady hands. One of them, Dorothy Dot Miller, remembered her first day. "I was a secretary before the war. Suddenly, I was in coveralls, learning how to drive rivets into the wings of a fighter plane. I thought, if I mess this up, some boy might not come home. So I never messed up." The work was grueling. The factory floor was hot, noisy, and crowded. Sparks flew from welding torches. Air hammers rattled like machine guns. Supervisors barked instructions, yet morale was high. Workers hung pin-up calendars and American flags above their stations. Radios played the same swing music that Navy pilots listened to in their ready rooms. Each Hellcat that rolled out of the factory wasn't just another airplane. It was a promise to give a young pilot a fighting chance. A promise that America's industrial heart would never stop beating. The numbers again tell the story. Grumman produced more than 12,000 Hellcats between 1942 and 1945, an average of 1 every 66 minutes. By contrast, Japan's Mitsubishi plants, struggling under bombing raids and raw material shortages, could only build a fraction of that number, often by hand, 1 piece at a time. To the Japanese, every aircraft lost was nearly irreplaceable. To the Americans, every loss was already covered by the next plane rolling out of Bethpage. Workers knew it too. They pinned newspaper clippings of Hellcat victories on bulletin boards. Some painted messages on the inside of panels, words like "Good luck, boys," or "Take this to Tokyo." For many women, the war changed everything. Housewives became mechanics. Secretaries became welders. Teenagers became inspectors. They were the living embodiment of Rosie the Riveter. One recalled, "We didn't feel like we were just building airplanes. We felt like we were fighting back." And in truth, they were. Every rivet, every bolt, every sheet of aluminum they shaped was a weapon. Every Hellcat they finished was another nail in the coffin of the Zero. The Japanese pilots never saw these workers, never knew their names, never imagined that the real battle wasn't just in the skies, but in the endless factories of America. The invisible army at home gave the Hellcat its wings. And soon, in the skies above the Mariana Islands, those wings would deliver the most crushing blow of the Pacific Air War, the day the Hellcat turned the sky into a slaughterhouse. June 19th, 1944. Skies over the Philippine Sea. The Pacific sun blazed down on an ocean that stretched forever. From the decks of 15 American carriers, hundreds of F6F Hellcats rose into the air, their dark blue wings glinting in the light. Below them steamed the might of the U.S. Navy, Task Force 58, carrying nearly 900 aircraft, more firepower than Japan could hope to match. For Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the Japanese fleet, this battle was supposed to turn the tide. He had gathered more than 400 aircraft, including Zeros and new models rushed into service. But many of his pilots were green, some with fewer than 100 hours of flight time. Against them stood Hellcat veterans, hardened by Wake Island, Rabaul, and Truk. At 10 o'clock a.m., radar operators aboard the carrier USS Lexington spotted the first wave of Japanese planes, about 70 strong, closing in fast. The order rang out. Hellcats, scramble! From then on, the battle unfolded like a nightmare for Japan. Wave after wave of Zeros and dive bombers came screaming toward the American fleet. And wave after wave, the Hellcats tore them apart. The air was filled with tracers, black puffs of flak, and the endless roar of engines. One Hellcat pilot, Lieutenant Alexander Vraciu, shot down 6 enemy planes in just 8 minutes. He later described it simply. It was like a turkey shoot back home at the county fair. The name stuck. By nightfall, the numbers were staggering. The Japanese lost over 300 aircraft in a single day, 3/4 of their attacking force. The Americans lost just 29. For Japan, it was more than a defeat. It was annihilation. Not only were the planes gone, but the precious veteran pilots were gone with them. Men who had trained since the 1930s, survivors of Pearl Harbor and Midway, were now burning wreckage on the sea. Their replacements were boys, barely able to land on a carrier. For the Americans, the victory was almost surreal. Pilots returned to their carriers with kill counts that seemed unbelievable. Deck crews chalked tallies on the fuselages of Hellcats. Men who had once faced death every mission now spoke of dogfights that felt one-sided, even easy. The contrast was stark. 2 years earlier, Japan's Zeros had ruled the Pacific, feared and respected. Now they were prey. The hunter had become the hunted. A Japanese survivor later admitted, "We went up knowing we would not return. The Hellcats were everywhere. We could not fight them. We could only die." The Great Marianas turkey shoot was more than a battle. It was the death of Japanese naval aviation. After June 1944, Japan never again fielded an air arm capable of challenging the United States. And at the center of it all was the Hellcat. Ugly, heavy, mocked at first, but now the undisputed king of the Pacific sky. And then when historians look back at the Pacific War, they often speak of Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Philippine Sea. But behind those battles, behind every Hellcat in the air, was something larger, something that went beyond wings and bullets. The Hellcat was more than a fighter plane. It was a symbol of America's system at work. Japan had built the Zero as a masterpiece of design, a razor-sharp tool placed in the hands of a few elite pilots. But that philosophy was brittle. When those veterans were gone, the weapon lost its edge. America took a different path. Instead of gambling on a few aces, it built a machine that any well-trained young man could fly and survive in. The Hellcat wasn't about perfection. It was about practicality. Strong, forgiving, reliable. A plane that gave a rookie pilot a chance to come home alive. This was democracy translated into steel and aluminum. At Grumman, line workers had a voice. They weren't faceless drones. They were mothers, fathers, wives, and husbands who knew their work mattered. They could suggest improvements. They could push for safer tools. They were invested not out of fear, but out of pride. Contrast that with Japanese factories, where workers labored under military discipline, shortages, and constant air raids. There was no flexibility, no innovation from the ground up, just rigid obedience, and eventually exhaustion, and numbers told the tale. By 1944, The US was producing 12 Hellcats every day. Japanese factories struggled to produce a handful of Zeros in a week. American training programs pushed out thousands of new pilots. Japan sent boys into combat with barely 100 hours in the cockpit. The difference was not just industrial, it was cultural. A captured Japanese officer after the war admitted, "We thought democracy was weakness. But in your system, every man, every woman, even every machine worked together with purpose." We could not understand it until we saw it crush us. The Hellcat was the embodiment of that truth. Built not for glory but for survival, backed not by a few elite designers, but by an entire nation. And that's why the laughter in Rabaul in 1943 had turned into silence by 1945. Because the Hellcat was never just a fighter, it was proof that the strength of a free people working together could outlast and overwhelm even the most disciplined enemy. The Zero had been a marvel of engineering genius. The Hellcat was a marvel of collective will. And in the end, that difference decided the skies over the Pacific. The war ended almost 80 years ago, but the Hellcat still sits proudly in museums across America. Its blue paint has faded, its wings folded as if resting after a long mission. Visitors walk past and see just another old airplane. But for those who flew it, the Hellcat is something far more personal. One of them was Lieutenant James "Jim" Dawson, a Navy pilot who flew Hellcats off the USS Enterprise in 1944. He lived long enough to sit in one again, decades later, at a veterans reunion. Reporters gathered, asking what it felt like to climb back into the cockpit. His hand rested on the control stick. His eyes grew wet. "This plane brought me home," he said quietly. "Every time. When they laughed at it, when they said it was too heavy, too ugly, we didn't care. It kept us alive, and that's all that mattered." For Jim, and thousands like him, the Hellcat wasn't glamorous. It wasn't graceful, but it was faithful. It was tough. It was American, and that was enough. Looking back, Dawson reflected not just on his aircraft, but on what it represented. "We didn't win because we were the best pilots. We won because we had a whole country behind us. Kids building planes, women working the factories, farmers feeding us, families saving scrap metal." The Hellcat was their hands, their sweat, their hope, flying for us out there. He paused, then added, "The Japanese laughed at it once, but when the war was over, no one was laughing anymore." The laughter of Rabaul had turned into silence, into ashes scattered across the Pacific. The Hellcat had done its job, not just as a weapon of war, but as a symbol of what free people can do when united. Today, as the Hellcat rests under museum lights, it carries that story still. A story of young pilots, of workers in denim coveralls, of a nation that proved strength comes not from perfection, but from unity and resolve. If you stand close, you can almost hear it, the echo of engines, the roar of 650 caliber guns, the heartbeat of America's arsenal in World War II. And maybe, if you listen even closer, you can hear something else, the faint memory of laughter that ended in silence. Before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about the Hellcat story? And did you or your family ever have a connection to this era? Share it in the comments below. I read everyone. And if you'd like to keep uncovering more untold World War II stories just like this, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell. That way, you won't miss the next chapter in history we bring to life.